welcome everyone. This is the third in a UK series of open data seminars, and we're very pleased to have Alex Coley with us today. He's a data policy and standards manager for Defra, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And I noticed a slight sort of irony of having somebody from Defra here. Well, we've got the air conditioning going and the radiators on. You know, but we'll just ignore that for a moment. You can say that hopefully it'll balance itself out. So Alex is going to be able to say in a minute what he's going to be talking about, and I think it's fair to say got experience not just in Defra but across government as well, doing some of the kind of activities that we've been talking about and we've been thinking about. So hopefully we'll bring a lot of experience to bear with that. Defra is now one of the leading government departments for publishing open data, and I'm told that the Defra network has published nearly 400 datasets on data.gov.uk. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear about that. Just in terms of format, I think Alex is going to be about sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, and I'm so happy to be interrupted.
40 if I'm interrupted, but
okay.
yeah.
But there will be, so if there are points during the presentation I think you want to pick up on, then please do, but there will be time for questions and answers at the end of this. And then there is food in the foyer after that, for those who can stick around. We were planning to live stream this, but we've been bedeviled by technology, so the talk will be filmed. And then we'll put that up on a video later on, but the questions and answers at the end won't be filmed, so that'll be a sort of private in-camera discussion. And for those who want to tweet during the event, it's the hashtag is OpenDataHE, open data lowercase and HE uppercase. So I think with that, I'll just hand over to Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody. So I work in Defra, so I've come, just as a sort of bit of background, I've come from sort of previously the Environment Agency, which is one of Defra's agencies, so sort of moving from the operational to the kind of policy side of things. And today I was going to kind of talk really about the open data journey that as a department and our sort of broader network of agencies that are sort of going through, and sort of picking up some of the cultural, technical and organisational challenges and sort of where we are in that journey. So we're not definitely at the end of it, but we're certainly sort of moving along and seeing some of the benefits as well. So Defra as a department is relatively small in the kind of financial scale of things within government, but is fairly complex and it has a very broad remit. So in terms of kind of off the sort of the title side of the thing, environment is quite a kind of broad ranging, but also it includes the sort of food side, so food security, and also rural affairs, so all of farming, animal welfare, floods, avian flu, which you might have heard about in the news at the moment, and so on. So a huge kind of array of different policy areas, and sometimes they conflict with each other. They're all relatively data rich, so in terms of the way that the department works from a policy point of view is around providing evidence to support policy and operational delivery, also often delivered through the underpinning of kind of data. So data has always been very important for Defra, and there have been some complexities in that which I'll kind of pick up. Also, Defra is quite complicated in having a lot of arm's length bodies, so it's got about 30 at the moment. So the sort of what's called the Defra network of the core department and all of these arm's length bodies is quite varied. So that ranges from very large organisations such as the Environment Agency and Natural England through to some of the national parks are included, and also some very small advisory boards which are kind of fairly independent. And some of those departments are very close. So some of those arm's length bodies are very close to the department in that the minister has some very direct control over them, as opposed to some much more arm's length where there is obviously some funding control and some governance through an executive board, but beyond that they're effectively independent directly from ministers. So that causes some complexity. In terms of open data and open data within Defra, it's about the whole Defra network, so it's all of those and all of those problems that come with it. So not a small challenge. So as I was saying, one department, but an awful lot of agencies, and they range in terms of their remit being very narrow and very broad. So the Environment Agency covers a huge amount of things, as does Natural England, whereas some are much more targeted and focused to a particular area. We're also, as I said, we're very data rich, so there's a huge number of data sets that we have and that we use. We don't necessarily own all of those. We have this problem which is not seen by all departments in terms of the way that we use data. So Defra and our agencies particularly will buy in data, or they'll get it from a number of different places. That might be other parts of government, or it might be from the private sector, and they will use that data in combination with somebody else and derive a new data set out of it, which then becomes the underpinning evidence base to make either operational decisions or to inform policy. And that data is often the data that people are really interested in, but there is inherited intellectual property in it from these other organisations that it's been provided from, and that has obviously causes some issues, particularly in kind of open data push. Just in terms of some political context, Defra is responsible, as all departments, for having an open data strategy, but for Defra it's a little bit more nuanced in that we have some particular policy areas that we own on behalf of all of government. So environmental information regulations, Defra is the responsible department for those, and also the INSPIRE Directive, which is a Spatial Data Infrastructure Directive, which is not directly open data, but is based upon open data standards and certainly encourages the use of open data, and Defra is responsible, and in fact my team is responsible for that piece of policy within the department. So there was an open data white paper a couple of years ago, and that required all departments to have an open data strategy, and Defra, alongside many other departments, published something which was a fairly boring document that described what we were going to do in purely terms of there's going to be these particular set of data sets that we're going to release. There's these few headings that the Cabinet Office have provided us that we're going to follow. We didn't find that overly successful, and there was an opportunity to refresh the open data strategy as part of the Open Government Partnership action plan last year. So we published a new version of our open data strategy in December in 2013, which was really trying to focus on the cultural change, so picking up some things that I'm going to talk about, but really about changing the way that Defra works and moving Defra and its agencies from being fairly typical of all of government in terms of being hesitant about open data to moving to that being the default position. So really changing the whole way that the department works. And the strategy tried to pick up some things which I'll come to later. But that was also in terms of recognising, and as things sit within Defra, which is different than other departments, is that we've sat open data policy very much alongside technical delivery in terms of sort of data architecture, alongside INSPIRE and some of those pieces. Some departments have put it very much in with the library and records management side of things, and I'm not saying that that's wrong for those departments, but we've taken a slightly different tack, and that's deliberately to pick up some of the things that I'm going to come to later, which is around use. So for us, it's really important that people can use our data, and that's purely for selfish reasons, that we have these environmental outcomes that we need to do that are quite expensive. If people are taking use of environmental information in making decisions, it may be that they will take a different decision, and therefore we will have to spend less in the future on it, on impacts and so on. So really it's around using that evidence and data and information in the broader sense to try and influence what people do, and therefore maximising and making it as easy as possible for people to use and have our data and use it is really important, and that kind of comes out in the way that we try to deliver our strategy. And as I said, INSPIRE Directive about spatial data. And just curious, show of hands, who's heard of INSPIRE? So typical small number of presenters in the room. So it's a spatial data infrastructure directive. And weirdly, it's with Defra, you might think, but it's actually an environmental directive from the European Commission. It's about the ease of sharing, so interoperability of data in the broader sense, environmental, so it includes road networks and things. And it places it places requirements on all of government. So any public body, if it's got data that's in scope of this directive, will have something to do. And the reason I kind of mention it in an open data presentation is because it's based upon open standards. It suggests that the data should be open by default, and it certainly would. You have to provide some evidence of why that you're charging if you are, and also it in the UK, the provision of INSPIRE is through data.gov. So if you search for data on data.gov, you will find, well, the majority of public authorities that are publishing spatial data are doing it through INSPIRE services, which are delivered through data.gov. So that's kind of the reason to mention it. And as I said, so Defra and its kind of focus is really around using data and open data to help us get some of these environmental outcomes. And I'll pick up some examples of this a little bit later. And those outcomes could be around changing people's perceptions. It could be around an actual cost reduction. It could be about informing some other government policy. It could be about lots of different things. It could even be about reporting compliance with some European directive to the Commission. All of these things, they all often relate to the data that we use and about how we share that data with other people. So open data is really about reducing the burdens and costs on us to share that data more easily, and particularly as we work in partnership more, so moving towards working with volunteer sector particularly, and that includes on environmental monitoring and so on, and doing that in a way where we can share data with them and they can share data with us in a a true partnership without having some cost of the data transfer from a purely licensing point of view with them. So that's kind of a key thing, and it's something that has been sort of building over a number of years. As I sort of mentioned, users, and we hear it a lot at the moment, particularly in the departments, there's a drive, particularly as building digital services, to move towards those digital services being built upon user needs, and that's really important for Defra, but particularly on the data side of things, it's really around making our data useful from a kind of usable point of view, but also making it useful from the actual information in there being of use to somebody, and that could be lots of different sorts of people, but trying to find ways to help understand what people want and need from our data so that we can design it in a way to make it more useful in the future. The first Defra open data strategy set up something called the Defra Transparency Panel. A number of these exist, so a number of departments or combinations of departments have got, they're either called sector boards or transparency panels, and really they're there to help underpin these open data strategies, and Defra is a senior management group, so it's got it's chaired by Defra's Chief Operating Officer, and it has a number of key either chief execs, or for some of the very large organisations like the Environment Agency, it's the executive director that's responsible for data or evidence who sits on the board, and then we have a number of external people. So we have some external challenge people who try to challenge Defra and really push things. So we've got those of you on Twitter, you might know Owen Basfava. So Owen's quite active in the open data community and very vocal, and is also very experienced within environmental data. So he sits on the board. We've got somebody from Experian, and we've got somebody from Office for National Statistics, who is our sort of privacy representative. So kind of covers some of the sort of privacy issues. The board, the panel owns the open data strategy. So they're the kind of the sort of from a governance point of view, they're also there to act as the champions within Defra and the department. So they have set the level of ambition that the strategy tries to deliver, and then each of the network bodies try to implement that strategy based upon that ambition that has been set by the panel. We'll come back to this. So the panel has been in existence, as I said, from the first strategy, and it sort of signed off and contributed significantly, obviously, to the new strategy, and is in place. We've had a little bit of a change in our kind of governance in terms of the new chief operating officer coming in. So there's been a little bit of a delay in having a meeting in the last couple of months, but they meet at minimum quarterly and have really been there to kind of challenge back to the Cabinet Office who are represented on the panel in terms of some of the things that they may feel are unrealistic expectations upon particularly some of the agencies. So the strategy, as I said, is published on GovUK and on data.gov, and just in kind of taking through the kind of principles of it, open by default. That's the kind of Defra position as a whole that's been signed off by all of our agencies. That doesn't mean that all data is open, and we'll come to that. And it doesn't mean that for some of our agencies, very much of their data is open yet. So we'll kind of come back to that. And just in terms of defining open and defining data, this has kind of been a challenge, and this has been something in terms, I'm going to pick up some of the challenges later, but this is one is we're probably going through a few times, is what do you mean by open? It means different things to different communities. So we've followed what's in the Open Data White Paper, in that we've taken effectively the Open Knowledge Foundation definition of open data. But kind of the important thing in that is that we're talking about free, yes, but it's the freedom for reuse. So it's really about making sure that how we use the Open Government Licence, and for all of Defra, we're only accepting the Open Government Licence as our version of open. So we're not allowing our agencies now to create their own version of what open data means within their own licensing. So it's the Open Government Licence, but that means that you're free to reuse it effectively without restriction. There's sometimes a few little things in there, but in terms of that kind of freedom to reuse, that's one of the particular things around trying to reduce the burden on people in terms of using the data, that they don't have to try and understand all of the different nuances in how they can use that data. And defining data as well, that again, depending on what community, and I'm assuming that's something that you found in some of the other discussions, is that what do you mean by data? And it's been a bit of an issue within Defra actually, is that depending on what community you talk to, it means different things. So if you talk to the stats community, they get very het up on the definition, because statistics has their own regulations, and statistics regulations are quite important to statisticians, and there are some kind of legal aspects with it. That you have to follow certain procedures. So, for example, under the stats regulations, if there's issues around when you can publish and not preempting some of the national statistics going out, that doesn't mean that at the end of it, the national statistic can't be an open data set. So we do have to follow those procedures with the statistics. That doesn't mean that the data wouldn't be open. It might also mean that the raw data can't be fully open and available until the national statistic has been published for a particular year. So those sorts of issues has to be covered. There are some communities where the metadata can become almost bigger than the data itself. So there's an awful lot more descriptions about the data than the actual data. And there are, within particular research communities, and it's a problem within the family, within Defra, that there are those aspects where people get very interested in the whole descriptions of the data and the broader context than necessarily the data itself. That they're not excluded, so we try to keep it as open as possible, but we are trying to concentrate on the kind of things that you would more usually expect in terms of a data set, a product that can be shared and reused. Another key tenet of the strategy is transparency in decision making. So that really is around being transparent about the decisions that we make on whether something is open or not. So there are cases where data can't be open, and that could be because we don't fully own it. It could be that at the moment we've charged for it, maybe, and that there's a process that we have to go through to change the business model within the particular agency. It might be because the minister has said that it can't be open, right? That could happen. It could be that it could be that there's a commercial issue, or it could be any number of reasons why something isn't open at the moment. So what this means is that we will tell people why it can't be open, and we'll also move to trying to say what would need to change to make it open, and that could be that we need to find some money, it could be that the law needs to change, or it could be that we have to do something to the data set. It might be we have to strip something out, replace one of the data sets that we use to derive it from, or a number, many other things. But we would tell people why, and we would give some kind of rationale, and we would explain the sort of timescale where we would look at these things and revise it. So also in terms of our licensing and all of those other things, we would be as open as possible about all of those aspects, and be clear to people kind of the underlying thinking and the processes. This is really hard, so we've agreed to do this. That doesn't mean that this is easy. And it doesn't mean everybody necessarily feels comfortable with it. We'd be responsive and understanding. So what that means is that we would, when people ask us something, we would kind of try and respond to them quickly. That's also sometimes hard. And we do that with some understanding. So we'd at least try and understand what people are actually asking for, and we would try to have some dialogue with them to see whether we can get around some of the issues if something can't be provided. And we would also look to kind of, particularly in terms of understanding of certain third parties, in terms of there are organisations that currently buy data off some of the Defra network bodies. At some point they're not going to be buying it, they're going to be getting it for free, but they may have built some business model on the idea of that data being charged for, and therefore there was a limited set of other people who would have access to it. They've made some investment and they've built a product. Suddenly their business model is going to change. We need to at least understand that. That doesn't mean that it's going to change the situation. We are moving to being an open data organisation, but we need to at least understand their views and take account of that, and it might change the way that we do things. It might change some of the timing. It might be about giving them fair warning, those kind of things. And some of that comes out in the respectful as well, and particularly in terms of other people's rights. We're not going to share somebody's data if we're not legally allowed to. That's kind of important. And that's also, we're not going to share people's data if it's personal data. So we're really not about, and it's slightly less of a problem for Defra, but we're really not going to be publishing personal data. Some of the aspects where that might become a little bit more nuanced in the future as this kind of developing area that we're looking at is around some of the remotely operated vehicles, and sort of surveying with that is around making sure that we're not publishing. There are aspects of the kind of privacy area that will mean that we'll need to be cautious in how we share that data. Important thing, and it's been in both strategies, and it's something that we kind of regularly refresh, not as regularly as we should do, but that is something that we're working on, is around data release. So that's in terms of actually identifying what data sets we've got, telling people what we've got, whether it's published or not. So on data.gov there's this concept of unpublished data. Defra has listed more unpublished data than any other department. That doesn't mean it's all of it, right? So we continually go through and refresh that, and also identifying what we can release and when we can release it, and then actually getting on and releasing it. So that's a process that different Defra network bodies are at different stages with on that process, and we'll kind of come to that in a minute. We use open standards, so an other important aspect, so there's open data about the freedom to reuse, the free bit, then there's this piece which is all as important, and actually for Defra probably slightly more important, is around the open standards. So that's around making our data available using open standards, and particularly doing that in a way that reduces lock-in for people. So particularly in terms of working with companies and volunteer sector, is about not locking them in to have a particular piece of software to use our data, but it's also around ourselves in terms of opening up, moving to a more open architecture within Defra, so that we're not locked into individual sort of software vendors, and building our own internal stack upon open data standards. So that's really important for us. In terms of the 5-star, we have a number of examples of linked data. I chair actually the Government Linked Data Working Group, which is kind of a thing where we are progressing the use of linked data within Defra. We're not doing all data as linked data at the moment, but we are focusing on particular aspects, and I'll come to a little bit of that in a minute. User prioritisation and feedback. This is really important. We don't do enough of it. We are learning about it. It's one of the things that is probably the bigger challenge. Having actual people, real people in the world telling us what would be good. So we've got this maybe massive list of data sets that need to be published. We'll get to them all eventually, but which ones do we do first? Which ones are the more important? That's quite hard because we can make it up, but what people actually need is harder to find, and to some extent is what have you got. That in itself is hard, but actually once people know what we've got, actually the sort of prioritisation of that is difficult. And the feedback, telling us what's wrong with data sets and actually using that to improve them and having an idea of continuous improvement is really important. It's kind of built into a number of, in terms of our data management policies, it's built into the open data strategy and other things, but actually getting that feedback and building mechanisms to help people feedback. So you can feedback on data sets through data.gov. It doesn't mean it works very well. So kind of learning that and sort of building the way that we do that prioritisation is an important aspect. So in terms of what we've got over 1,000 data sets published. They're not all open. So this is on data.gov. So if you go to data.gov and you go to publisher and you pick department and then tick the box to do all of the arm's length bodies as well, you'll get over 1,000 data sets. Over 900 data sets declared that are unpublished, so we've got quite a way to go. I would say that the numbers here are probably massively underreported at the moment, but we're way ahead of many departments in terms of declaring what we've got. And we've got over 410 that are INSPIRE-based data sets and services, so these are ones where there's an actual data service there, so you're not just getting a list on a link to a CSV file or something on the top. You're actually getting a download or and a web feature service and something that you can kind of build into a web application. So we've got a number of those, and that would also include some of our, and also on top of that we've got a number of sort of broader linked data services which have got APIs and so on built on them. We have a number of real-time data services, so we have things like the real-time flood data, that's now river levels and the flood warnings and alerts. They're all available as open data and they're updated every 15 minutes during a flood incident and slightly less frequently in the drier season, but they'll be moving into, I think they're now on every 15 minutes, so in the parts of the country that have got higher rainfalls. So in terms of implementation, we're kind of into implementation about almost a year in. It's challenging. I think we've been very ambitious with the strategy, and that was deliberate, that we wanted to set the ambition very high, kind of recognising that we probably wouldn't be able to do it all as quickly as we'd like. It's been harder than we thought. The cultural challenges within the department are a little bit harder than we'd hoped, a lot harder than we'd hoped. And there are a lot of barriers, and I think we recognise these barriers, and what we're trying to do is identify them and work them through. And they kind of break down into a couple of categories. So there's technology barriers, that's complexity. Some of our data is quite complicated, some of it is very frequently updated, or it's relatively large in volume, and it sits within operational systems that have been designed in the dark ages, so that getting it from outsourced provider that we have in place to something that is accessible and can cope with the sorts of potential numbers that you get with it being open is sometimes a problem. And resources, in terms of that prioritisation and which ones you do first, can cause issues. So for example, there's some data sets, so one that's very interesting to a lot of people is the water quality archive that the Environment Agency's got, so it's that rich history of all of the monitoring that's done. It's a big data set, it's too big to just be as a dump, you couldn't just export it as a table and provide it to people, so we have to build some service on the right side of the firewall to do that, so that requires some funding, so we have to find that money, and there's only certain windows within each year to do that, so again that causes issues. Cultural barriers, and I think actually this is the biggest problem. Everyone's different, right? Everybody individual is different and has their own idea, and every organisation is different, and that causes us an awful lot of problems Defra is definitely a mixed bag in terms of organisation, so they all have different priorities. Some get on very well with the department, some maybe less so, and that you have to play off those politics a little bit. We've actually got over 22,000 staff in total across all of the Defra network, so it's quite a lot of people. I mean, a lot of them are on the ground operational delivery, but every single one of them is different to some extent, and they all have their own different views. And this is a cultural challenge, really, rather than technology. This is around the mindset of data being open and it being there very quickly and people using it, and that causes concern with most people, actually. And some of it is skills. We are moving towards a very different model. People are very used to some of the older techniques. They're not used to necessarily even the formats that the data is being made available in now. They're not used to some of the underlying technology and the kind of web focus. They're also maybe not au fait with some of the kind of due diligence processes that you have to go through for making data open, so they're concerned about making the wrong decision and it being open, and then they can't sort of backtrack that, so they'll sort of almost as a sort of nervous response, they will be very conservative in how they kind of take decisions, so it will take longer to get things out than might be necessary. Tracking progress actually is one of the hardest things. So we've actually done a huge amount, but an awful lot of it's hidden, which is kind of ironic in open data and transparency, but it's true. And particularly with the Defra network that is very dispersed, and you don't want to put huge amounts of reporting burden on them, because actually what we want to do is to have them get on and publish the data and make it available and have people using it. But tracking progress is something that we need to learn how to do better, and I think that's something that we're not unique in government with that problem. So just in terms of kind of where we're going, so finding what resonates is kind of what we're working on, and in terms of that's with those individuals. So different people, different things will be important to them in terms of open data. So for some, it's about policy delivery. If the data is open and out there, then people understand it, and therefore they might build some trust. So they will not feel that everything is hidden and there's this just political decision that's been made upon some evidence base that isn't available. So there's that kind of aspect. Some policy deliveries are about working in partnership, so they're about us working with private sector or working with the volunteer sector, and again it's about helping that happen by the data being open. Some things are around effectiveness, so quite a lot of what we do and across Defra and the network is we so an example is we have a lot of monitoring of the environment that happens. You monitor this thing, so we call them determinants, so the kind of the individual thing, say in a water sample, the kind of ammonia or something like that we monitor. There's a number of different network bodies that may monitor water, and they might all might happen to analyse and record the value of ammonia, but they may all use different definitions for it. So one of the problems we've got is we don't publish at the moment that list of determinants with the definition against it, so that our own organisations can declare that they mean that thing, or people who want to work with us and provide us their data can say that we are meaning this to this definition. So what that means is when we get data in and try to combine it together, we have to do a lot of work to understand, do they mean this or do they mean that? And that adds a lot to our cost, and it means we can't be as responsive and as quick. So actually just by taking those things out of our data and publishing them separately, effectively as code lists that people can reuse, is a huge step forward, and so that's one of the things. Cost, actually for some cases, by making the data open, and that's not for all cases, but sometimes if you make the data open, it can make the cost of a project considerably less because you can do things in different ways. We can get influence. I kind of picked it up a few times in terms of influencing people to make decisions based upon the data, or you can even influence a project in how it happens because you're contributing a load of data for free. You can get a very different weighting on, and sometimes your data's not perfect, but it's free, as opposed to this other organisation that's charging for it, but you want them to use your data. This is quite a good way of doing it if the data's open. Innovation, we've seen a number of examples where, particularly in terms of, obviously government can innovate, but in terms of making our data available to other people, we've had some really good innovation happening on our data that we hadn't thought about, which sometimes we'll even start looking at using those approaches internally. which we would never have done if the data wasn't open. Business development in terms of building other people's business, which obviously doesn't mean money coming into Defra, but it means money coming in potentially in taxes and so on to the Treasury, which is very good for the Treasury. It's not necessarily something we see, but it is a driver. It is something that ministers get constantly asked about. So it's important, but it's not one that we necessarily directly see the benefits from. Resilience, something I'll pick up in a minute, and speedy response and all of these things. Particularly on the speedy response, if your data's open and people are used, so people have therefore had a play with it previously, and then you need somebody to do something very quickly, if they've already got some experience of it, they can deliver an awful lot more quickly. And we found that particularly in some of the flooding side of things in, this time last year. So just picking up that example, so just in terms of, there was quite a lot of flooding this time last year, you might have remembered, it caused some significant challenges for Defra and for DCLG and for the Environment Agency, and we moved to really look to respond during that challenge to a whole number of things, really, to how changing the approach to how we make information available could allow other people to help government and the public to respond to the challenge. So I'm not sort of saying advocating doing hack events, right, because they can help, but not always. But what we did was we ran an event with the tech community. So here in London, in Tech City, it was hosted by Google, but it was Microsoft and Facebook and Twitter and a load of small SMEs and a load of other interested people. So a lot of developers got together, and they used data that was mostly open data, including some of the river levels and the flood alerts from the Environment Agency, which we were able to very fast track getting open to make it happen for the event, but also other open data from government, including some of Ordnance Survey's open data and some other things. They developed some apps, right, to help actively during the flood response, and some of you may. So does anybody actually live in an area that was affected by flooding? Okay, right. So if you did, and you've got a mobile phone app with Facebook on a mobile phone, if you were in an area affected by flooding, you'd suddenly get a message on sorry, I've got it as this. So this was Facebook app. Suddenly it would put up this thing and say, are you affected? And Flood Volunteers, which is a charity that was collating together a load of other information around where you could get sandbags, people that could help, and that might be help pick your kids up from school, it might be help bring you some food, it might be we've got a spare dishwasher because yours is broken, those kind of things. That charity was collating all that information, not government. What government did was provide the information about where the areas that were affected by flooding, and what Facebook did is they took that data feed in real time, and then they would push the link to every single person who was in one of those areas affected when they went on to Facebook, using the geolocation on those mobile phone devices to then point them at. They didn't do it to everybody in the country, because obviously there were large parts of the country not affected, so it was only pushing people who were in the area, and that was all driven by open data in the background. And they Facebook turned that round, they did it at the event, and it was live the next day. Flood Volunteers did a whole load of extra pieces around that. There was Oxford Flood Volunteers. They put little micro river gauges on in Oxford, and that puts a load of alerting in. So they supplemented the Environment Agency's monitoring, and they were using the Environment Agency's data and theirs, and it was linked to the local authority and various other things. So it was kind of some crowdsourcing of some additional pieces, I think it was on the previous slide. So this one here was simulation. Taking some Ordnance Survey data that wasn't fully open, and taking the river level information and projecting what that would mean in an urban area, so London, in terms of potential areas for flooding. So really looking at individual building level. Now that's not necessarily kind of quite fully accurate, but it's a direction in terms of where they're going, but particularly in terms of visualising things So this is something that could be used within government in terms of helping politicians and senior managers visualise what it would mean, what particular scenarios would mean. So quite innovative actually in terms of how they did it. And they were sort of, they actually won one of the, I think Microsoft gave them, or Google gave them, about £10,000 worth of Azure hosting, so to get them up and running as a startup. So those, as an example, it's one aspect, but it was one that was, was quite successful. It resulted in the Environment Agency moving to much quicker to moving towards being open data and releasing some very significant data sets, and they are going through that process. Today they've had the first open data advisory group, which is an external group that is helping advise them on their prioritisation and other aspects. So we're working on some things, implementing the strategy, but particularly focusing on a couple of areas. One thing, the panel had a problem, was that they didn't know if what we were doing and individual organisations was any good compared to each other or compared to the outside world. So they aspire to being good open data publishers, but they don't know what good means. And we put in a proposal which we've been successful in getting some funding for, and we're doing it jointly with the Open Data Institute, is to build a maturity model. So you hear these things of kind of different maturity models, but one for open data organisation, which would include governance and technical and skills and what's actually being published and so on, that individual organisations can effectively score themselves against online, and that would go on to data.gov, and we'll do that for each of the Defra network bodies. So that in itself is quite useful. But in terms of how we're going to use it within Defra, what we can start to look to do is, once we've got a way of actually benchmarking and potentially tracking progress, that the panel can make commitments for each of their organisations of agree this is where they are and this is where they want to be. This is something that's high enough level that we can track it and track progress, and then we can effectively build it into KPIs, so actually put it into the organisational management structure, which is the way to make it happen. If you make it a problem to the chief exec and the senior management in terms of things that are tracked that would affect their pay, that's a way to make things happen more quickly and more robustly. So that's been agreed that that's the sort of approach that we'll take.